Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. We're very excited to have author, researcher, explorer, a whole bunch of other titles, Chad Lewis back with us, and very excited to see his new presentation on Midwest Circus Legends and Lore. We're also very grateful to the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund for making programs like this possible. And so if you like programs like these, you'd like to see more, please let me know and I'll do my best to bring them here. But I'm going to go ahead and I'll turn it over to Chad and let him take it away. So, thank you.
Thank you. Well, hello and welcome, everyone. Just put on the microphone for you. First of all, I'd like to thank the staff for having me back here this evening. But just as important, all of you who are curious enough to show up to talk about Midwest Circus Legends and Folklore. As you heard, my name's Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, I've spent the last 30 years traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual, from roadside attractions to weird people, some odd places. You name it, if it's just offbeat and weird, I've traveled around the globe in search of this unique history, bizarre folklore. But tonight we're going to talk about one of my absolute favorite topics, that is circus legends and folklore. For the next 45 minutes, we're going to travel back to the days when the circuses were the kings of American entertainment. And this isn't going to be your traditional circus history. There are plenty of great books and documentaries if that's what you're interested in. This is going to be a little circus history with a lot of stories that you won't find anywhere else. Those odd stories that don't quite make it into the general public version of the circus legends and lore. So with that, let's step back to the circus days of America. And for that, the modern circus did not begin in America. It began in England. As you can see, in 1768 was the first circus, mostly acrobats riding horses doing tricks. It wasn't until a couple decades later when it was brought to America for the first circus program in Philadelphia. Again, mostly acrobatics and a lot of riding of horses. It was said that over 400 people showed up for that first circus. According to legend, even George Washington was in the audience watching that circus as well. The question then becomes, how did the circus work? The circus began with the advance men. These were the people that would come to your town a month or two in advance of the show. They were the advertisers. There was no Instagram or Facebook, so they would show up in town and plaster their banners and posters over anything that was in town. Your barn, your local stores, your walls, and this allowed you to get excited for the circus. For a couple months when the circus was coming, you'd know all about it because you were staring at these beautiful old advertisements all day long. And in the early days, the circus came from horse and wagon, or the old circus wagons. So they could only travel about 8 or 9 miles per day, usually stopping in other towns. And this is where they hauled all the animals, all of their workers, and all of their gear. But don't let these old black and white photos fool you. Most of the old circus wagons were very elaborate, brightly colored. They were a form of advertising, like seeing a Pepsi-Cola truck on the highway. That's exactly what they were doing to get your interest. Then the day of the circus would arrive. They had already secured a land rental on the outskirts of town, large enough for the gigantic circus. That's when the day laborers, the rustabouts, would start working, start putting up all of the tents and everything needed for the circus. Believe it or not, they lost a lot of crew at every stop, but they gained a lot of crew of people wanting to run away to the circus. If you were a young teen in town, you could get paid to work at the circus for the day, and they'd give you a free ticket to that night's circus if you helped set up the circus. And that's when they started with the parade downtown. This was a little teaser to get the town ready, to entice them to come out and see the circus. Many people would often judge whether or not they were going to buy a ticket based on how impressive the circus parade was. If they had one sickly elephant and bad costumes, no one would go. But if they came in full force, the entire town shut down for the circus. Businesses, churches. In my home state of Wisconsin, when the circus came in 1848, all of our lawmakers shut down and went to the circus together. Might not be a bad idea today for them to do the same thing. Schools were given the day off so kids could go to the afternoon circus. Usually there were two circuses, one in the afternoon, one in the evening. The one in the afternoon catered more to young families and students and focused a lot on all of the animals that were at the circus. Teachers gave them the day off because they thought they could learn more about natural history and animals in one day at the circus than they could all school year in their classroom. And most people had never set eyes in person on these animals. They may have seen pictures, but they didn't see them in real life. And even in the most rural, conservative towns, they allowed the children to go to the circus. Mainly because the circus promoters were geniuses. They would say, well, this is family entertainment because these animals, they're straight from Noah's Ark, right out of the Bible. Come learn about them. And of course, that worked. But remember, this was at a day when they weren't competing against the radio or movie theaters or obviously television or internet. The only main competitor for the circus was that of the live theater. And many towns were not big enough to house an opera house or a live theater, so the circus was the only game in town. But oftentimes the circus was late, postponed, or canceled because, again, they were working with muddy roads at best, going through fields, getting lost, sometimes getting stuck so heavily that the elephants could not pull the circus wagons out of the mud. This obviously all changed in the 1870s when they jumped to the railroads, put the train cars on the rails. This allowed them to skip over those not very profitable small towns and focus on the bigger cities where they could set up and do multiple nights at a time. One of the most common questions I receive about the circus is, what's the difference between the circus and the carnival? Well, they overlapped quite a bit. The circus predated the carnival, at least modern day carnival. And when we think of the circus, we think of it more as being human performers with a lot of animals included, whereas the carnival focused a lot more on the mechanical rides, the Ferris wheel, and the games of chance where you could win all the prizes or not win all of the prizes. Both of those, the carnival and the circus, had the delicious midway, the beautiful food that was offered, the treats everybody loves. And these people were freelancers. They were called the privileged men because they paid to have the privilege to sell at the circus. So they were their own entity. Both the circus and the carnival, one of the most popular parts of them was the freak show, the sideshows. This is where if you were born with a genetic abnormality, oftentimes during those days, you would be put on display at a local dime museum or the hardware store in order for people to come and watch you and interact with you. Often, if they were lucky, their parents would allow these kids to run away and live their lives on the road with the circus, with people like P.T. Barnum from Barnum and Bailey's show, and later Robert Ripley of Ripley's Believe It or Not fame. And believe it or not, their parents would allow them to, because they knew that not only would they have a much better life on the road than they would back on the farm in Minnesota, they'd make a fortune while doing it. In fact, at one point in history, both P.T. Barnum and one of his freaks, General Tom Thumb, were two of the wealthiest men in America. To Give you an example of how it worked. This young girl from Minnesota, the Woolly Girl, was on display from the age of 2 years old, where her parents brought her around mostly with mid-level promoters, where she was the Woolly Girl. She suffered from hypertrichosis, which would grow facial hair all over her body, the upper torso and the face, at least of about 8 or 9 inches. And she became a very well-known circus performer with the carnival's Alice Elizabeth Doherty. Now today we shun the freak show, the sideshow. The only place where you can see a daily freak show is out at the Sideshow Museum out in New York on Coney Island. And most of the freaks there, they're man-made or self-made freaks. People who turn themselves into freaks of nature, like Eric the Lizard Man or the Mexican werewolf woman or vampire woman, pardon me, where it's a lot of piercings and implants and body modifications rather than being born with a genetic abnormality. Here in the Midwest, this was the epicenter of circuses. Over 100 different circuses got their start in the Midwest, mostly through Wisconsin, Minnesota, and a few in Indiana as well. So the question remains, why the Midwest? What was it about our area that the circuses loved? Numerous reasons, but the first being we had plenty of water and plenty of crops, which may not sound like a lot, but keep in mind that the average elephant could drink 50 gallons of water a day and ate a ton of food. That's one elephant. Imagine having 24 elephants, hundreds of other animals, along with a staff of a couple hundred as well. You needed a lot of food, a lot of water, and we had the forest that allowed them to cut down the timber to make sure the animals did not freeze during the winter months. More importantly, though, it also allowed them to beat the eastern circuses to the Midwest. When spring came here and the weather finally cooperated, all the circuses could set out and clean the Midwest out of all their disposable income long before the circuses of New York and the East Coast could get here. By the time they made their way here, all the money was gone, everybody was in the heart of farming, no more fun at the circus. Which is why we have so many self-proclaimed circus capitals of the world here in the Midwest. Most people believe that the undisputed circus champion is Baraboo, Wisconsin. Mainly in part thanks to the Ringling Brothers. Now, this is not just one guy, these are the 5 brothers. I know they look very similar, but that, yeah, it's the mustache. Beautiful. But they got their start actually in Iowa, in McGregor, Iowa. They were young kids, and it was said they saw a steamboat come in and perform a circus, and they said to themselves, we could do this as well. So they grabbed a couple of their pets and farm animals and put on their own Ringling Brothers circus out in their yard or in the barn. The home has since burned down, but there are talks that they're going to rebuild it and recreate it in McGregor, Iowa, giving the history of the Ringlings. Also in Darlington, Wisconsin, they claim to be the home of the circus thanks to this gentleman, Joe Parson, who ran the Parson family and Parson Brothers Circus. His act mainly was a high wire act, but instead of just walking, he would often use specialized roller skates or a bicycle and ride on the high wire above the tent. Believe it or not, some of the Ringling Brothers worked for the Parson Circus when they were just getting their start. And then later, when the Ringlings became the undisputed champions of the circus, the Parson family was the privileged men for the Ringling Brothers, switching roles quite a bit. Now, the Parson family circus is important because they claim to have many of the first. They claim that they were the first to invent some of the most tasty treats of the circus, including cotton candy, Cracker Jack, and pink lemonade. Even by circus standards, this was a bit of an embellishment. we'll see a little bit later how pink lemonade came into effect, and it wasn't through the Parson Circus. Here in Minnesota, you had a lot of your own. You have the Osmond Shriner Circus that began in 1923 in St. Paul, and they're still going strong today. But again, a lot of people point to Baraboo, thanks to the Ringlings, because they put their winter quarters there along the river in Baraboo. They had over 20 winter quarters. Now, the Ringling brothers became very wealthy, some of the wealthiest men in America, mainly because they were advertising geniuses. But the media took it a step too far, because in the 1800s, from 1896 through 1898, America had a large flap of these airship sightings. Hundreds of people in hundreds of towns throughout the Midwest would often go out and report seeing a giant blimp or craft floating over their town. Sometimes it landed near the town. Sometimes they could see pilots that looked like they were foreigners, whatever that meant back then. And you could follow the progress of these airships as each newspaper covered them from Austin to Duluth and beyond. No one ever explained what the airships were, who was responsible for them, except for one reporter who said it was so magnificent it had to be the Ringling brothers that were doing it. The reason they blamed all these UFO sightings on the Ringlings was because he said, the researcher, the author, said that he saw a train car come into Baraboo and they unloaded something under a tarp, so it had to be that UFO. But if you're going to go to Baraboo, watch out for the phantom elephants that are thought to roam through Baraboo. This legend goes back to the 1950s. A woman, a widow, living on 8th Street, which is 33, Highway 33 as well, received reports from her neighbors saying, "When did you get those strong workhorses in your backyard?" She had to tell them she didn't have any horses, but they kept seeing them back there. Then the neighbors started reporting things were banging and smashing into her small shed in the backyard. But when she went back, nothing could be found, but it sounded like something was trying to knock the shed over, like thunder banging in the shed. Eventually, it was such a mystery, she called the police. By the time the police showed up, they were investigating the loud sounds when something grabbed the car and towed it about 3 blocks uphill before leaving it behind. Well, the story started circulating, and it turned out that the woman's deceased husband had once worked at the Ringling show with the elephants. And they had torn down one of the elephant barns, and he used the scrap to build his shed in his backyard. So the legend began. People started seeing a phantom elephant smashing into the shed in the backyard. It finally demolished the shed. Now, you can imagine my excitement when in 2017, people in Baraboo were reporting more elephants on the loose. But unfortunately, they weren't phantom elephants, they were real elephants. They had escaped from circus world and were eating people's gardens and trampling through their backyards. But you won't have that happen anymore because the elephants are no longer at Circus World. They've been retired. They no longer perform with the Circus World circus. But people still see those phantom elephants moving around. And my recommendation is when you go right by here, stop at Circus World Museum. If you have not been here, this is a national treasure for America. It started out in July of 1959, and they've been putting on a circus every year since. All summer long, every single day, they will have a circus performance. Plus, they have more memorabilia, the old banners, the costumes, all the equipment, the circus wagons, more than anywhere else on the entire planet. In fact, of all the original circus wagons that exist from the heyday of the circus around the world, 2/3 of them are in Baraboo at Circus World Museum. But now we turn to maybe something not as fun, because Baraboo is also home to the clowns. Now remember, believe it or not, in the old days, People were not terrified of clowns. They loved the clowns. They were the most popular part of the circus. They were the most infamous. They became celebrities. People went to see them just to see the clowns and their sad antics. But over the last few decades, with horror movies and true crime shows and books, people have turned against the circus clown. But in the old days, they needed so many, they came up with a clown college that you could go to, where you could learn to become a clown. And if you graduated and were very talented, you'd get a job with the circus right away. Today in Baraboo, they have the Clown Hall of Fame there. You can go there. They change it every couple years. It's a great display if you like clowns, and it might be an escape room if you don't like clowns. And then in Baraboo, people talk about the Ringling Brothers still haunting the place. This is Al Ringling, his old mansion, which is now a brew pub and bed and breakfast. And people have gone there and seen Al and his wife Lou both walking around. Right down the road, Al is thought to be haunting the Al Ringling Theater. And even if you don't believe in ghosts, this is a theater to go visit. It's gorgeous. And then, of course, at Circus World, they think they see ghosts there as well, too. But it's not just Baraboo. If you move on to Delavan, Wisconsin, they claim, wait a minute, we're the birthplace of the greatest show on earth. And they do have a long history dating back to 1847 when the Mabee brothers came into town with their 27 wagons and 8 elephants. According to legend, the Mabee brothers were traveling from Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Janesville, Wisconsin, when they stopped to hunt some prairie chickens in Delavan and said, this would be a great place for us to have our winter quarters. Of course, they had their whole crew with them, including this gentleman, Pete Conklin. Now, Conklin did invent pink lemonade. It was his invention, according to legend. The main version goes something like this. The circus was down in Texas, 1857, selling lemonade, and it was hot, and they sold out. Water was the most precious commodity at a circus. Every performer got a bucket, and that was theirs, because you couldn't just turn on the hose, you had to pump it and bring it out. So, of course, the lemonade man, Pete, he ran out of water, so he went around the circus trying to find any spare water. Eventually, he got to this young woman's stand and realized she had just finished performing her act and had removed her pink outfit and had been washing it in her water bucket, cleaning it up after the performance, turning the water pink. Well, the circus must go on, so he grabbed that bucket of pink and made pink lemonade, and it's been a treat. You'll never drink pink lemonade the same way again. They also were the first to invent the popcorn ball. And obviously, when your name is George Popcorn Hall, you probably had your part in it. They have a beautiful mural for him in Evansville of Popcorn Hall as well. But it wasn't until a few years later when these two gentlemen came to Delavan when it really took off, mainly because of Mr. Coop here on your right, because he was the one who convinced the greatest showman in the world to join in their circus, none other than P.T. Barnum himself. Now remember, this was 1870 through 1871. Barnum was already an extremely old man at 61 years of age. He was retired. He had a full career. He started it with his American Museum in New York. He got his start advertising Joyce Heth, who was said to be a 161-year-old former slave, who not only was almost 200 years old, but was the nurse of George Washington when he was a child. When she died, the autopsy showed she was probably around 80 years of age, but let's not let that get in the way of a good story. And then he made a fortune off Jenny Lind, who, if you've never heard of her, when I do this program at schools, think of Taylor Swift. That's the Jenny Lind is the Taylor Swift, the Swedish nightingale. Is thought to have a beautiful voice. And of course, I already previously mentioned General Tom Thumb. Barnum traveled the world with General Tom Thumb, who did a lot of performances in front of royalty from the world, kings and queens all over the world. And one of Barnum's best known gimmicks was the Fiji mermaid that he put on display. And he advertised it not like this. He advertised it as a beautiful siren of the sea, a topless mermaid. So you can imagine people surprised when they got there and it was like this that they were seeing. But they also were the first to incorporate the second and third rings into a circus. And they did this out of profit, because when they had one ring, they would sell the expensive seats, but people up in the cheap seats couldn't see very well, so they would just simply walk down and sit on the floor in front of the expensive seats. So they thought, if we have 3 circles and rings, no matter where you were in the building or the tent, you'd have a view of what's going on. So there'd be no discrepancy over who's sitting where. Everybody would have a good show. They also were responsible for the first beauty contest in America in 1881, giving $10,000 to this young woman who won the beauty contest at the time. In 1907, the Ringling Brothers bought the Barnum and Bailey Circus and combined into 2 shows, eventually making it into one giant greatest show on earth. If you go to Delavan, they still have a lot of the murals for Barnum in town. If you go to their local cemetery, a lot of the circus folks are buried there, including the original Mabee brothers. Right down the road, you could make the argument that St. Peter, Minnesota, had a great circus history with this married couple, along with their family, who began running about in the 20s and 30s with their show as well. They were considered themselves the Sunday school circus, because they allowed no drinking and then no shortchanging allowed. And shortchanging was if someone came to buy a 20-cent ticket to the circus and gave you $1, you'd give them 70 cents back. You'd be shortchanging them a dime or a nickel, and all that added up. So they were considered honest because they were following in the footsteps of the Ringling Brothers, who had that same reputation of pickpockets weren't allowed and unsavory characters were not allowed to travel officially with the circus. They started, obviously, the Shell Brothers and the Zellmer Brothers circuses, and they've lost a lot of their equipment in 1936, and both of them are buried in Green Hill Cemetery in St. Peter. You can look for the giant elephant there by their gravesite. Or in Belle Plaine, Leo Albright. Now, he was born in 1890, but you can see his first circus when he was 10, going on 11. He was performing with a lot of his friends and the pet goat, putting on performances of the circus. He would go on to become a very well-known circus performer, balancing a wagon wheel here and working with animals over the years as well. And both he and his wife are buried in Belle Plaine as well. I'm fascinated by how we blame the circus for everything, not just the UFOs you saw earlier, but sea serpents as well. This is Lake Michigan. In the 1800s, Lake Michigan was filled with stories of a Loch Ness monster-type creature in the waters. You can go through the old newspaper archives and find dozens of reports of sea serpent sightings in Lake Michigan. One of my favorites occurred in 1900. Some construction workers were working near the shoreline, building a new building, when they took their lunch and went down to the water. That's when they saw a giant serpent rise up toward them. They immediately ran back to the construction site to grab their tools. They wanted to kill this thing because they said none of their friends or family would believe they had just seen a sea serpent longer than both their horse and cart together. But by the time they got back, the creature had descended into the depths of Lake Michigan. Of course, the media caught hold of this and said, oh, they were just confused. They had seen a school of carp swimming around. That's what spooked them. When that story didn't stick, They said it must have been an escaped circus animal, a sea lion, escaped from Adam Forepaw's popular show, although Forepaw said he was not missing any of his animals. This next story I love because it feels like if you went to the drive-in movies and saw a bad horror movie, this would be the story that you would see. It involves a place called Haunchyville in Muskego, Wisconsin. Now this story starts where all weirdness in America starts. Florida. Thank you. Circus performers would winter down there, and the little people would live there, and they were being mistreated by their manager, physically and emotionally abusive. So they decided to put an end to the manager for good. And when they did the deed, they moved up to Wisconsin near the lake in Muskego in a forested area surrounded by cornfields where they lived in their own small community away from the prying eyes of everybody in town. Eventually, they became known as the Haunchies, living in Haunchyville. It was said that they hired an average-sized man to patrol the area with a shotgun, that if you were brave enough or foolish enough to go to Haunchyville, he would shoot at you. I've talked to people who claim they had their windows shot out by buckshot trying to go see the Haunchies. The legend was there were a series of smaller buildings and stop signs were all at waist height, not realizing that's a snowmobile trail. But that you could go there on Mystic Drive and see the Haunchies, that they've been there for over 100 years and they'll curse you. But the problem with the story is that every day more and more of Haunchyville is being gobbled up and developed into big homes with manicured lawns. So a lot of Haunchyville is gone. There's not much left, so if you want to go there, you might want to go there soon before it all disappears. Where the Haunchies are going to go, who knows, maybe they'll come back with you in your car. But the most fearsome creature of the Northwoods of the circus was not the Haunchies. It was the dreaded and deadly hodag of the Northwoods. If you lived in the 1800s, early 1900s, most likely you would go to a county fair or a circus and see the hodag on display. If you've never heard of the hodag, this is what it's like. It is said to be a dinosaur-looking creature with spikes down its back and tail, huge claws, fangs, and a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. Nobody knew more about the hodag than Eugene Shepard. He was a timber cruiser. His job was to go into the woods, research how much money was there if the lumber companies bought it. One day he was out looking through the woods near Rhinelander, Wisconsin. He came across a hodag. Gave it no mind, but when he came across one the next time, he grabbed his friends together and they went on a hunting expedition and they were able to capture the hodag. He then put it on display at all the county fairs and the circuses where you could pay to go see it in a crate behind a curtain. Usually it was too dangerous for them to let it out, or if it did get out, people would run out of the tent screaming. Eventually he brought it back to his house where he dug a big pit in the front yard, and when the Smithsonian came to investigate, they found his kids in the pit moving the levers and all the wires of the hodag. When they asked if it was a hoax, he said, "Of course this one's a hoax. The hodag's too dangerous to actually capture." So, yeah. And people still ask me, where can I go to see the hodag? And I tell them, go to Rhinelander. It's everywhere. They have statues all over. Their local high school mascot is the hodag. It's on all the emergency and police vehicles. And you won't have to worry because everyone knows the hodag only eats white bulldogs on Sundays. What's interesting is they have a Hodag Heritage Festival every May, and the people next to me in my booth have 2 white bulldogs they bring with them, and they've been safe so far. But what about a circus being cursed? Well, the Wallace Show certainly would make a good candidate for that. They started out with their star attraction, Big Charlie. He did not like being a star attraction. You could say he hated it. Even though he was 4 tons, he ended up killing several trainers and bystanders and the like. So eventually, even though he was the star moneymaker, they had to poison him with an apple or two, and he passed on. They thought that would do the trick. They were done with the curse. Until a few years later, when they came to my hometown of Eau Claire, Wisconsin, put on the Great Wallace Show, brought all of the elephants, but there was a thunderstorm, and it struck Ella, their star attraction. Ella died where she fell over. Some of the other elephants were just knocked over in Eau Claire, but they survived, but not Ella. And what do you do when an elephant dies? Well, you bury it right where it dies. And that's what they did on the East Hill neighborhood. And they had to protect it that night while they were digging because snake oil salesmen were coming and cutting pieces of the elephant to sell as tonics and healing potions of the time. So they lost their animals in Eau Claire, but the circus went on. 1903, another tragedy struck the Wallace Show in Durand, Michigan, with a railroading accident where 23 were dead along with many of their animals strewn about. But little did they know this would just be foreshadowing something even worse, because they combined circuses and thought they had a new lease on life in 1907, a giant profitable circus. And this lasted for over a decade until 1918, when they were coming back from a show in Indiana. They had pulled off of the rail a little bit to sleep. Well, while they were all sleeping in their wood cars, the train coming up behind did not notice all the people waving to slow it down at night. The engineer had fell asleep and they crashed into the back of the Wallace Circus. It wasn't the impact that had the most effect. It was the fire, because they were lit with lanterns. And when they got smashed into, you can imagine the devastation. They estimate that somewhere about 86 people died and more were injured. What remained of the bodies that they could find, the charred remains, were brought to the Forest Home Cemetery, the Showman's Rest in Illinois, where they have a great banner marker for the tragedy. And the problem was nobody really knew how many people were buried there, because a lot of the circus everyday laborers, the roustabouts, people didn't even know their real name. They simply were Medicine Mike or West Side Willie. Some just went by their nickname, Baldy, and they were there. So nobody knows exactly how many were actually buried there. And yes, if you're wondering, there are stories of it being haunted as well, of people hearing circus music and animals parading around as well. But sometimes the circus isn't lost, it just remains hidden. If you've ever been to Durand, Wisconsin, or if you're going to go, stop into the old Corral Bar. This is a beautiful place. So busy, so good of a food and restaurant that they had to expand. So they tore down one of their walls, only to find behind it was another wall, a previous outer wall that had a circus banner on it, an advertisement that hadn't been seen in over 100 years, hidden behind their wall. So what they did amazingly is they saved it. They spent thousands and thousands of dollars encasing it in protective glass, just the way it was back in 1885 when it was advertising the circus coming to Durand. You can go there and get yourself a beverage or a meal and enjoy the circus that hadn't been seen in 100 and some years. We get a lot of our sayings from this circus. Time to go see the elephant. This originally was time to get excited, go see the elephant at the circus, literally. But then over the years, it took on a all-purpose of a sense of adventure. You're going on a road trip, time to go see the elephants. Kids are having a sleepover, time to go see the elephants. You're going to the movie theater, time to go see the elephant. It was meant as, let's get ready, we're going to have fun, this is going to be a great adventure. We also got the saying, hold your horses, directly from the circus, because today, obviously, you know it means to slow down, be patient. But in the old days, it literally meant hold your horses, because most horses had never seen an elephant before. So when the elephants came through, the horses would panic and charge off, trampling people, injuring folks. So before the elephants came, they would tell the crowd, hold your horses, here come the elephants. And we still use that today, just not for elephants. Also clowning around, I don't need to say anything about that, especially when all of you hate clowns. I'll just skip right over that. But eventually the circus lost its importance in America. Through the decades, it was hit with rising costs of hundreds of animals and hundreds of staff. It was just too expensive to keep going. Also, all those other things that I said were not competing with the circus in the early days, they began competing with the circus from movies, TV, and the internet. Also, America was changing its views on how we viewed animals working in the circus and how they should be treated or if they should be in the circus at all. And this all came to a sad day when in 2007, the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus closed down their doors. And whether or not you like the circus, this was a tragedy because this was older than Major League Baseball. They began years before baseball began in America. It was truly the American tradition. But smaller circuses continued on through the years, including most recently, the last couple decades in the Twin Cities, Circus Juventus. They put on they're young kids that participate in a circus school, and then they put on a circus. I've been to numerous ones, and they're always great. If you get a chance, go see them. And by keeping this going, it prompted like a great phoenix rising up for the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus to come back. In 2023, they started their show again without the elephants, without a ringmaster per se, more of a Cirque du Soleil type feel, but still the circus continues on. And I think as long as we all love the circus and continue to love live performances, hopefully the circus will continue on for another couple hundred years as well. So with that, if you want more information about the circus or carnivals, my website has more than you could ever want or need. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here at the library. Grab one of my books, go on your own adventure of Minnesota. And when you do, I think you'll discover that you live in one heck of a weird state. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some odd people. And along the way, you might just discover that the strangest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I'll open it up if you have any questions, comments, or stories from any of you. Otherwise, you let me off the hook very easy this evening. But the circus, I think, is just absolutely fantastic. As a young boy, my mother would take us to the Northern Wisconsin State Fair in Chippewa Falls, not too far from my hometown of Eau Claire. When I was in grade school, we went through an old freak show tent, and there was the world's smallest woman in a glass encasement. And she was so small, sitting in like a living room facade, that I asked my mother if she was real. I had no idea, being a grade schooler, and yes, she was, and that was what got me interested in the circus. And then, of course, there's so many ties of haunted places that are circus-based as well, and the freak shows I always loved. So, yeah, I'll end it here. Sure.
I was just wondering how, like, an elephant became such a focal point. Like,
Yes.
Do you know when that started, or?
Right from the beginning, if you could afford one. If it was said you were not a real circus unless you had an elephant. And the simplest reason was the size.
Yeah.
Nothing could compete. You could have lions, tigers, a giraffe, but there was nothing like the elephant. Plus, they could make a lot of money giving rides of elephants. And that was a popular thing recently as well, that you could put your kids on the basket and they'd go around with the elephants, and much more exciting than the donkeys or the llamas that offered the same. So yeah, it was the elephants, and often they were taken in brutal conditions, taken away from their herd or their mother. often just stripped or killed everyone else and took who they could. And they fetched an enormous price from the circuses, yeah. But the ones from the circus world, they were sent to a retirement home, if you will, a sanctuary for elephants where they live out the rest of their lives. And by comparison, people in Baraboo told me the elephants, for captive elephants, had a pretty good existence for captive elephants, that in the old days they'd let them just wade into the Baraboo River and wash, but eventually it got too hard with broken bottles and that in there. They would cut up their feet. So, yeah, so no elephants there, but still a lot of animals at the circus world. People train dogs and cats and even a lot of horses still moving about. So, yeah. Yes?
Well, I have two things. Is the Shrine Circus still around? That's the one that I used to go to when I was.
The Shriners still put on a lot of independent circuses, yes.
And then I went to see a circus, something or other in Wisconsin, but I thought it was like something to do with P.T. Barnum.
Well, they do bring Barnum into circus world because the Ringlings bought Barnum, and they have Barnum in their freak show, and they talk about Barnum because he was the biggest name. But yes, or you could have been in Delavan, or who knows where you might have been.
I thought it was Baraboo. But
Yeah.
I don't remember it being that big of a deal.
Yeah, it's pretty.
Was there off season or something?
Yeah, if you're not there in the summer, there's no show. It's just the historic remains, the museums. And then years ago, it wasn't. Today it's owned by the Wisconsin Historical Society.
Oh.
So they've put in a lot more resources. So, but I will stick around if you want to tell me a story in private or ask a question. Sure.
I was going to ask you, when I was in grade school, which was a lot of years ago, we would go to the Zurich Shrine Circus in Minneapolis at the auditorium. And they had a lot of animals: tigers, lions, chimpanzees, elephants. Why and when did they discontinue having the assortment of animals?
Yes.
Just focus on the elephant.
It's been a slow, steady decline over the years, mostly because of budget, of just hard to handle, but also a lot of public blowback about using animal, not just the elephants, but any animal in the circus. So it was going for decades, where eventually it just became dropping off one by one. You'd get rid of the tigers. And in circus world, they held on with their tigers because they did a entertainment education. So they would educate you about tigers through the world, how they're dwindling in numbers, and then show them doing a couple tricks. But it was more about showing it, and then you could buy artwork of the tigers, and it would all proceed Tiger Foundations. So they kind of skirted it for a few years, but it was just mainly cost and public sentiment.
Haven't there
Yeah.
been a lot of accidents revolving around the circuses?
Oh, yes. Quite a few. Hartford, Connecticut had the biggest fire. The Ringling Brothers, many people died, and today it would have bankrupted them, but they pleaded saying we can't pay for all of the damages if we don't run the circus. They had it was raining that day, so they had not used their main tent. They used the old tent that was sealed with a flammable oil. And it caught fire and just went up. But yeah, there were train accidents, there were lots of fires. It was a dangerous, and a lot of it wasn't even known to the public because, again, if you were a rustabout and you died, nobody knew. You might not even know your real name, kind of like the old lumberjacks in a way. So, but again, I'll stick around if you want to tell me a story. Stop back at my table, grab as many free postcards from me as you want. You can terrorize your enemies because that's one of the postcards. But again, I want to thank the library for putting this together. How great you can come to a program like this at no cost. You can check out a wealth of information, a real treasure for the community. So if you like programs like this one, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like this program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, they put a ton of work into getting me here tonight, and they should be applauded, and thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack. So, what do you think?
That was great.
So, again, we're very excited to offer programs like these, and we're very grateful to the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund for making programs like this possible. I do have a short survey for everybody. I have to go grab it from my desk to take, and it really helps with the grant reporting and making programs like this possible. But again, thank you everybody so much for coming. And if you're watching this later on our YouTube channel, by all means, like, subscribe, and all that fun stuff. But thanks for coming, everyone.